He used to arrive early, open the windows of his office, and find there on his expensive mahogany desk a small arrangement of wildflowers. They were simple, sometimes poorly cut, from the garden of the house of a woman who barely spoke, but who looked at him as if she still believed in love. Until one day he ignored it. He called it a poor thing. He said that his office looked like a grocery store. He didn't notice her eyes lower or her hands clenching in embarrassment. He only noticed the silence and then the emptiness. The flowers never came back, nor her gaze. And in that luxurious office, the absence began to smell like regret. What seemed like a trivial criticism, a casual comment on a bad day, was actually the beginning of an invisible crack that would grow slowly and cruelly. Because pain doesn't always scream, sometimes it just stops appearing. And in that discreet absence, he began to realize how much that daily gesture was, in fact, the only living detail in that suffocating place of power. But when he wanted to go back, time no longer offered any return, because certain flowers, when stepped on, do not grow back, and certain hearts, when crushed in silence, learn to no longer feel. If this story has already caught your attention in the first few seconds, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It makes all the difference in helping more people find stories like this. Lost between the glass and marble walls of the 42nd floor, where the view of Manhattan seemed like a prize reserved for a select few, Mr. Graham no longer noticed time. The wall clock marked the hours as a useless reminder, and the days piled up like unread papers on his desk. CEO of an imposing investment firm, owner of a reputation forged based on results and cutting-edge decisions, he was the kind of man who didn't say good morning. He just expected everything to be ready when he arrived. And it always was, including that little vase of flowers. It was there again. Like every morning for the past few months, discreetly placed on the corner of the desk, with wild flowers, sometimes a little disheveled, sometimes wilted at the edges, but always colorful. A simple gesture that he never asked for. And honestly, you never thanked him. Maybe because you didn't know who put it there, or because you thought it didn't matter. But it mattered. For her, every day mattered. Charlotte. Her hair tied in a simple bun, her clothes neutral, her steps light. She was an administrative assistant, but she made a point of stopping by his office early before starting her routine. The garden in front of her house was small, but big enough to grow daisies, lavender, and chrysanthemums. It was her maternal inheritance. Planting was her way of keeping alive the memory of a childhood where everything was cared for with love. And leaving flowers for her boss was the silent way she found to remind herself that kindness still had a place in the world. On that particular morning, the sky was overcast and the city breathed the heavy air of the eve of rain. Charlotte carried in her hands a makeshift bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in a simple ribbon. As she arranged the arrangement on the corner of his desk, the door opened with more force than usual. Graham came in, talking on the phone, irritated, gesticulating, immersed in problems of falling stocks, stalled mergers, and a client about to cancel a contract. He glanced at the desk, frowned, and without thinking, twice cut the air with the harsh voice that so terrified interns. "Get this out of here. It looks like a poor man's house. This is an office, not a market stall." Charlotte froze. Her hand was still holding the ribbon. Silence fell between them like a blade. She said nothing. She simply picked up the vase with the flowers and left without rushing. He didn't even notice. Or if he did, he didn't show it. He returned to the connection, turned his chair to face the window, and went on with his day. As if nothing had happened. But something happened. And the next day, when he walked back into his office, there were no flowers. For the first time in months, the table was bare. And at first he thought it was nice, cleaner, more professional. But as the morning went on, the emptiness seemed strange to him. The silence seemed more echoing, and that corner of the table was different, as if something was missing that he could never name. On Friday, no flowers. The following week, neither. And so little by little, the discomfort became absence, and the absence began to hurt. Not a strong pain, but a discomfort that sets in little by little, like a longing that arrives before you even understand what you're missing. And he didn't know it. But her heart had begun to wither along with those discarded flowers. He only realized the absence when everything around him remained the same. Except that, the flowers never made a noise, never claimed space. But now, in the silence where his office seemed bigger and colder, their absence screamed. Charlotte didn't change her schedule, she didn't resign, she didn't comment on what had happened. But something in her had withdrawn. What had once been a light walk through the hallways had now become just another one among many. She began to carry out her tasks with technical precision, but without soul, without the brilliance she once put into even organizing papers with care. He noticed. He noticed like someone who feels a chill and doesn't understand where it comes from. At lunch on Tuesday, Graham, with his leather briefcase and impeccable tie, walked past the kitchen and saw her sitting alone, staring out the window with her fork in her hand and a lost look in her eyes. For a few seconds he thought about stopping, about saying something, but pride is a high wall for those who have built their lives without ever apologizing. So he kept going. But the discomfort grew like a silent crack. Charlotte, in turn, expected nothing more. His gesture had been a gift offered without charge, without a contract. But hearing that phrase, poor people's thing, triggered painful memories in her. From the time when she was a child and saw her mother being humiliated for giving her flowers as a form of gratitude. People who mistook simplicity for lack of value. Flowers, for her, were more than decoration. They were an extension of the soul. And if that was ridiculous in his eyes, then she wouldn't insist. Time passed in warm weeks. The office remained organized, the routine flowed, but Graham began to notice the side effects of his own coldness. The employees seemed more tense. The laughter that echoed from some of the desks had stopped. He began to hear the sound of his own footsteps better, and his own loneliness. One rainy Saturday, as he passed by the flower shop near his house, he saw daisies in the window. He stopped. He thought about her. He went in. He bought them. He left the bouquet on her table on Monday before she arrived. A simple gesture, but coming from him, it was almost a revolution. When she found it, she looked at it without expression. She read the card written only with her name and a thank you. Did she smile? Maybe. But she put the note away, left the flowers in a corner, and didn't change her behavior at all, because an apology without transformation is just another attempt to alleviate guilt. He noticed and felt, because even with expensive flowers and a card he couldn't reach the purity of the lavender she was carrying. So for the first time he began to observe, for real, to notice what he had never valued, to think about what was inside her, and maybe inside him too. But there was a distance that money couldn't bridge, and that maybe it was too late to close. On that grey autumn afternoon, as the clock ticked slowly forward, Graham sat at his desk, staring at the reflection in the glass that separated his world from the pulsating skyline of the city. For the first time in a long time, the silence was uncomfortable. It was awkward. The crystal vase, once empty, now held flowers he had bought himself, but they gave off no scent or meaning. The colors were there, but they lacked life. Because gestures, when driven by remorse and not love, fail to touch. He realized this when he saw her pass through the hallway, glance at the half-open door, and move on, without hesitation, without looking inside. Charlotte had become to him like those forgotten flowers in the corner, essential only after loss. That same evening, Graham went down to the ground-floor garden of the company building. He had never done this before. He was wearing a grey overcoat, went down in silence, and there, among the ornamental plants, he stopped in front of a flower bed he had ignored for a long time. He touched the stem of a random flower and, with a strange feeling of helplessness, wished she were there, explaining how to care for it, how to plant it, how to keep it alive, because that was what he needed, to learn how to grow something without destroying it. But time, cruel when ignored, had already taken with it the spring that was in Charlotte's eyes, and he knew it. A few days later, in an almost childish gesture of insistence, he decided to make a simple coffee. He waited for the right moment and brought it to her table. She looked at him surprised. With a restrained smile, he simply said, "I'm sorry." He didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain himself. He simply handed her the coffee and left. And that gesture, bare of words and full of hesitation, touched more than any rehearsed apology. Charlotte remained there, with the cup in her hands, motionless for long minutes, as if time were trying to heal something. But it was still early, and deep wounds cannot be healed with small bandages. Yet something was moving silently between them. It was not reconciliation. It was something more subtle, awareness. And that is always the first root of true repentance. In early spring, when the corporate headquarters garden was beginning to bloom timidly, Graham authorized a new move. He quietly ordered the construction of a small flower bed in the inner courtyard, the same space where employees rarely stopped. He told the maintenance team that he wanted wildflowers, daisies, lavender, chrysanthemums, and he asked that no corporate signage or company logo be placed there. Just a small, discreet plaque with the inscription, "For those who understand that the essential is never great but always alive." No one quite understood, but they obeyed. And within a few days, the space began to draw attention to itself because of its contrast with the rest of the building. It was colorful, light, and quiet. Charlotte knew, of course she knew. She had walked by one morning, and when she saw the garden, she recognized every flower. Her eyes filled with something that was not sadness, but not forgiveness either. It was understanding. There was beauty there, but also a silent regret. Graham watched her from a distance. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say that he understood now. But he also understood that some understandings do not require words, and that too much talk sometimes spoils what only silence can heal. She stood there for a few minutes. She touched one of the flowers with her fingertips and walked away. He stood still. He didn't follow her. And that, at that moment, was the closest thing to an answer he would get. And perhaps the fairest, too. Over the weeks, Graham came down to the garden more often. I would sit on one of the benches and just watch. He would bring books he never read, sometimes a coffee that would go cold in his hand. But he would go, because it somehow connected him to something he had let die without realizing it. And now, even if there was no return, he wanted to stay close to the memory of the one who had been touched by it. Charlotte moved on with her life. She didn't ask for a transfer, but she kept her distance. The strongest flower is the one that learns to grow even after being cut, and that's what she had become. Time passed like seasons that no one notices, and Graham continued to frequent that small garden that he himself had ordered to be cultivated, as if each flower planted there was a silent attempt to repair something that should never have been broken. His colleagues commented, between whispers and sidelong glances, about the new habit of the director who had previously barely taken his eyes off the screen. Some said he was tired, others that he had lost someone. But no one knew. No one knew that for him, that flower bed was more than a garden. It was a public confession without a voice, an open letter to the woman he had hurt without realizing it. One morning in June, Charlotte received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten card. "Some flowers don't come back, but I've been trying to be fertile soil so I don't step on any more." No signature. But she knew. And when she read it, she didn't cry. Because she had already cried all she needed to. She just took a deep breath and put the card away in an old box where she kept other things that, to her, were valuable. She didn't reply. But that afternoon she walked through the garden and discreetly left a single flower among the others. It was a different kind of flower, the kind that hadn't been there before. But now, even alone, it seemed to belong. Graham saw her. From the top of the glass floor he saw the gesture. He didn't come down, he didn't go to her, but he smiled. For the first time in a long time he truly smiled, because he understood that was the closest thing to forgiveness he would ever receive. And that was enough. Because healing sometimes doesn't come in declarations or reunions, but in silences where both know that the pain has been understood, and above all, respected. That same year, after 4 decades of career, Graham decided to Retire. The news spread through the halls like a solemn whisper. Some were surprised, others were relieved. But he no longer cared what they said. He didn't make speeches, he didn't collect farewells. He simply emptied his office little by little, like someone collecting the last pieces of a life that no longer served him. The table that had once been his throne now seemed like nothing more than wood, and the place where the flowers used to rest, an abandoned altar of everything he had failed to value in time. On the last morning, before officially handing over the keys, he went down to the garden alone. It was early. The city was still yawning in golden tones. The flower bed was in bloom, more than ever. And on one of the benches there was something he had never expected. A small bouquet, tied with the same simple ribbon he recognized. No ticket, no name, just flowers. The same flowers from the beginning. The same colors he had dismissed with harsh words on a random day. He sat down. Slowly, his heart heavy with something he didn't know if it was joy or pain. He took the bouquet and stood there, his hands trembling, as if he were holding not flowers, but a second chance that would never come in its entirety, but still left a scent. Charlotte didn't show up. She didn't need to, and he didn't expect her to, because now he understood. He finally understood that there are gestures that don't ask for applause. There are loves that don't want a happy ending, just respect. And there are forgivenesses that are not spoken, but left in silence like flowers on a park bench that he once ignored. When he got up, he left the bouquet on the ground among the other flowers. Then he walked away slowly, without looking back. And at that moment, the man who once said that flowers were poor people's things carried in his chest the greatest wealth he had ever had, the light weight of humility. From that day on, silence filled the space with the same force that the flowers once occupied without being noticed. The office looked the same. The furniture was in place, the papers still piling up in folders on the desk, but there was a difference, a subtle emptiness, almost invisible to the eyes of those who don't pay attention, but deafening to those who are aware. Charlotte started arriving at the same time, with the same light steps, the same discreet posture. But I didn't pass by his office anymore. Not anymore. And when they crossed the halls, she just shook her head. Slightly polite but distant. Graham understood but didn't react. Something held him back, maybe pride, maybe uncertainty about how to undo what he had done, because what he had said had been cruel. And worse, it had been sincere at the time. He really thought the flowers clashed with the image of power he cultivated. He just didn't imagine that that small gesture was, for her, the only color in the gray of routine. Now, he noticed. Too late, perhaps. The lack of flowers began to bother him in waves. At first it was just strangeness, then uneasiness, and then longing. Not for the flowers themselves, but for what they represented. For the silent tenderness that was now missing. Absence became presence. He began to notice the corner of the table where they used to rest. It seemed colder there. And every time he entered the room, his eyes were drawn to that empty space, as if searching for a reflection of something he couldn't name. Charlotte, in turn, had become even more reserved. The shy smile she used to offer her colleagues had disappeared. She avoided Graham's eyes. Her hands now trembled discreetly as she typed reports. But she kept working, without anger, without drama, like someone who chooses to survive and not be noticed. One day he watched her from afar, organizing documents in the pantry, alone. Her hair with a few loose strands, her blouse frayed at the sleeves. And there, for an instant, something broke inside him. He didn't know what or why. He just felt it. And in that moment, she understood what she had never known, that the deepest beauty is not in what shines, but in what blooms even without applause. There was a part of Charlotte that no one knew about, a carefully guarded space where she hid everything that was too fragile for the world. The garden of her house was not just a yard with flowers, it was a reliquary of memories. There, planted among the stones and the weathered wooden fence, were stories that time had not erased. Her mother, a woman of few words and many wounds, had taught her from an early age that beauty did not have to be expensive, just true. "Flowers listen," she would say. "When you care for them with love, They return to you a silence that embraces. Charlotte had grown up in that world. She never had luxury nor promises. But she had roots, and it was among the daisies and chrysanthemums that she learned to deal with loss. Her father, her old house, her deferred dreams. The habit of picking flowers in the quay. Mourning and offering them to someone was for her more than a custom. It was a ritual. It was her way of saying, I am here, I see you. When she started working at the company, she felt too small, almost invisible. The cold rooms, the haughty looks, the low-voiced conversations that ignored her. But there was something about Graham that caught her attention. He was distant, it was true, but he carried a loneliness in his eyes that she recognized. And so, in the first month of work, she left the first flower on his desk, without signing, without expecting anything. And so it went on, day after day. Sometimes they were flowers that were too simple, almost wilted. Other times, colorful and vibrant. But all of them carried his most intimate gesture, care. When she heard that phrase said with contempt, something went out of her insides. It wasn't just the criticism. It was the contempt for everything she believed to be beautiful, for everything that came from her origins. It was as if he were saying that she in her entirety was a poor thing, and even though it wasn't the first time she'd heard something like that, it hurt as if it were. Because this time it came from someone she silently admired. The pain didn't explode, it just receded. And since that day, Charlotte kept her flowers. He began to water them only in his own garden. He dedicated to them a silence that he had previously shared. He stopped harvesting. He stopped offering. Not out of revenge, but out of instinct. Those who have been stepped on learn to hide their scent. In the days that followed, Graham found himself caught between what he didn't know how to undo and what he had never known how to value. Discomfort became a constant whisper in his consciousness. That previously irrelevant absence became a burden, and so in a clumsy attempt to fix what he didn't even know could be fixed, he decided to act as he thought a man like him should, buying expensive flowers from a fancy flower shop on Fifth Avenue. He chose an elegant, impeccable arrangement, wrapped in gold paper and silk ribbon. He asked for them to be delivered to the company with a handwritten card, "To thank you for your care, Graham." No full signature, no details, an attempt at humility within the controlled universe of his pride. Charlotte received the bouquet late in the morning. She stared at it for a long time, without any immediate reaction. She recognized the florist's style. The flowers were perfect, impeccable, cold. She touched one of the petals delicately and a sigh escaped. The card, on the other hand, didn't surprise her. It was generic. It said more about his discomfort than any real regret. She thanked the delivery man formally, took the bouquet to her desk, and left it in a corner. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't seek his gaze. She continued her routine as if it were just another Monday. But inside, something was weighing on her. Because it wasn't the value of the flowers that mattered. It was the gesture. It was the silent care she offered day after day, and that now, wrapped in luxury, returned as a currency of relief. She understood, and she chose not to fool herself. His flowers were beautiful, yes, but they were empty. They didn't grow from earth nor from soul. They were expired medicine for a wound he couldn't even name. Graham watched from afar, hoping for a smile, a sign, but nothing came. And for the first time in a long time, he felt small, inadequate. He realized that something inside him wasn't enough, that not every apology comes with an answer, and that perhaps for certain pains there are no shortcuts. That night when she got home, Charlotte threw the flowers in the trash. She did it calmly, without anger, and in the place where they had rested, she left a small vase with flowers from her own garden, simple, uneven, imperfect, but alive. It was on a cloudy morning that Charlotte handed in her transfer request. It wasn't a dramatic exit, nor an act of rebellion, just a silent step from someone who had understood that the soil there was no longer fit for her to flourish. She filled out the form in firm handwriting, took it to the HR department, and waited standing there, as if she knew there was nothing more to be said. When the news reached Graham, he was slow to react. He read the email 3 times, as if he could change a word with his gaze. Then he got up from his chair and stood in front of the window, looking at the city as if it offered him some explanation. But the only sound was the wind whistling between the buildings. He didn't question the decision, he just approved the request with a dry click. But he felt it, he really did. He realized he had lost something he didn't even know he had, and it was in that emptiness that he began little by little to rebuild himself. In the following days, he began to walk more slowly through the hallways. He observed people. He noticed details. He began to notice how much words, even when short, could weigh. He began to listen without interrupting, and responding less quickly. He wasn't a new man yet, but for the first time he was trying to understand who he was outside the armor he had worn for decades. Meanwhile, Charlotte had moved into the annex building across the street. A new, less formal environment, where her presence wouldn't make any noise. There she went back to taking care of the little details that few people saw. She organized the mugs by color, discreetly. Watered the plant in the hallway, smiled out of the corner of her eye. But there was something about her that hadn't returned. A reserve, a limit. As if she now lived surrounded by invisible walls. And Graham, even from a distance, could see this. Sometimes I would see her through the window, crossing the street with a briefcase in her hand and a light coat over her shoulders. I thought about going up to her. I thought about saying something. But I didn't know what. And every time I hesitated, time slipped a little more through my fingers. One afternoon, when he saw one of the interns making fun of an employee for her worn-out shoes, he intervened. Not by shouting, but with a look that froze the room. He apologized to the girl and offered her his own card to help her solve the problem. And when she left, confused, he sat in silence, because in that gesture he relived what he had failed to do with Charlotte, and he understood, then and there, that changing did not mean being applauded. For it was about preventing the same mistakes from happening again. The garden at the headquarters, previously ignored by everyone, began to receive discreet visitors. Graham, now without the rush that defined him, walked among the plants in the late afternoons, as if seeking answers in the simplicity he had always despised. He would sit on one of the benches, look at the flowers, and, in silence, try to listen to what he had never heard. He began to read about botany. He bought old books on the symbolism of plants, as if searching through the dusty pages for a manual to decipher the gesture that Charlotte had offered for so many months. In the kitchen, some employees noticed the change. He was less tense, less shielded. He began to ask names, thank people for favors, and give compliments without seeming strategic. A sense of confusion hung in the air. No one knew what was happening. But something in him had definitely changed. It was then that one sleepless night, Graham went down to the garden with a small vase in his hands. Inside it were simple daisies, picked by himself from a nursery. She sat on the bench where she used to see Charlotte passing by in the distance and, with trembling fingers, left the vase there. Next to it was a small note carefully folded. She had written it without a draft, directly, as if she could no longer escape. Flowers are not for the poor. They are for those who have a soul. Thank you for trying to teach me that. He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. He knew that if she saw it, she would understand. And if she didn't see it, the gesture was still genuine. In the morning, he passed by the place surreptitiously. The vase was still there, but the note had disappeared. Charlotte found the gift early in the morning as she was crossing the courtyard to a meeting. She recognized the flowers immediately. She knew they hadn't come from a florist. They were real, from the ground. They were imperfect, and for that reason, beautiful. She read the note in silence, her eyes filling with tears for the first time since that day in the office. She carefully put the paper back in her diary and looked around. She didn't see him, but she didn't need to. She knew he was close by, and that, for the first time, he was learning the language she had spoken all along. There was no reunion, there was no conversation, but there was understanding. And sometimes, the deepest regret doesn't come with a formal request. It comes with an unpretentious gesture. And in that moment, they both knew that something had changed, not erased, but transformed. The next morning, the vase was gone. Graham noticed it from afar, and instead of frustration, he felt relief. Its absence indicated that it had been seen, perhaps understood. All week long he continued to walk through the garden, always at the same time, waiting without waiting. And then, on a sunny Tuesday, he found in the place where he had left the vase a solitary flower, carefully planted in the ground. It was a wildflower, just like the ones she usually brought. Simple, a little crooked, with small petals, but unmistakably alive. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. But he knew. And the gesture, as silent as the one that had started it all, made him remain there for long minutes, with his eyes closed, breathing a peace he had never known how to seek. From that day on, a new routine was created. Every week, on random days, a single flower would appear. In that spot in the garden. Never in excess, never in bouquets, just one flower, and Graham, without fanfare, began to take care of that space with his own hands. He, who for decades had only touched paper and canvases, now learned to clean soil, water roots, and trim leaves. Some mornings he would arrive early for work, dirty the hem of his pants without caring, and return to his post with his hands still damp. The security guards would see him, the employees would murmur, but no one would say anything. It was as if everyone sensed that there was something too intimate to question. Charlotte never mentioned anything. She continued her life in the building next door, taking care of her tasks, smiling gently at those who respected her. But inside her something was softening. It wasn't a new beginning, it was a healing, knowing that he had understood, even if late, brought back a kind of peace that no justification could offer. And so the two of them continued at different paces, but connected by a silence that was no longer bitter, just mature. One Friday before leaving, Graham walked through the garden and found the flower of the week already wilting. He thought about taking it down, but didn't have the courage. He sat on the bench and just looked at it, without rushing. And there alone he understood that that flower, even though it was about to fall, had fulfilled its role. It had touched. It had transformed. The years passed with the lightness that only mature time can bring. Graham grew old in the same building where he built his empire, but now his steps were slower, his gazes were longer, and his words, finally, carried meaning. He no longer needed to raise his voice to be heard. The respect that once came from his position now came from listening. The garden, once marginal and forgotten between walls of glass and concrete, had become a living part of the company. Employees stopped there to breathe, talk, be silent, and everyone knew, even without being told, that that space held something sacred. No one touched the solitary flowers that appeared from time to time. No one took them, no one asked. They just respected them. At his retirement ceremony, Graham declined speeches. He accepted a simple coffee in the main hall, took photos with the team, and gave brief smiles. But what really marked his farewell was something no one expected. Instead of public thanks, he left discreet envelopes on some tables. They weren't expensive gifts, just letters, handwritten. In one of them, given to HR, there was a request that the garden be maintained, not for him, but so that those who come after him wouldn't have to learn late what he almost didn't learn in time. He asked that simple flowers be planted, always one at a time. He asked that no plaques with names or company dedications be placed there. May it continue to be a place where silence speaks louder than any ready-made phrase. Charlotte had learned of his retirement a few days earlier. He had received the news with a deep breath and a brief tightness in his chest. He had not asked to be part of the farewell. He had not even shown up at the cafe. But that same afternoon, he had quietly crossed the garden. There was no one there. He walked to the central flower bed, knelt for a few seconds, and placed with his own hands a blue flower. It was rare, beautiful, fragile, from his garden. He stood there for a while, in silence. Then he got up and left, as always, without warning, without fanfare. At the end of the day, when everyone else had gone, Graham took one last stroll through the garden before handing over his badge. He saw the blue flower in the late afternoon light, and knew, without a doubt he knew, that it was for him. There were no words. There was no reunion. But there was forgiveness. After Graham left the company, time no longer passed at the same speed. Now he walked slowly through the streets of the neighborhood where he lived, observing the details that he had previously ignored: the boy crossing the street in a hurry, the lady at the market choosing apples, the sound of leaves rustling on the asphalt. He had learned to see, and that was perhaps the greatest gift that all that silence had given him. To finally see what cannot be measured in numbers. At home, the garden that had previously been merely ornamental came to life. He planted with his hands, made mistakes, replanted, and patiently cleaned dirt from his nails. His neighbors began to greet him more kindly. He, who had previously barely known the name of the person living next door, now knew the pains and achievements of each person on the street. One day, while visiting an old bookstore downtown, he found a book on flower symbolism that reminded him of the one he had read years before. He bought it, even though he already had the other one. When he opened it at home, a flower fell out, pressed between the pages. It was a dried daisy, simple, yellowish. But when he saw it, something in his chest snapped, as if that small memory sealed everything he had been trying to understand from the beginning. He put the flower between 2 sheets of paper, and that same weekend, he returned to the building where he had worked for most of his life, not to go inside, just to walk past the garden. It was all there: the flowers, the benches, the respectful silence. But something caught his attention. In the center of the flower bed, where there had never been anything but flowers, there was now a small, simple, unframed wooden plaque that read, "In memory of the gestures that should never have been trampled on." He stopped. He read it once, twice, 3 times. He knew. With a lump in his throat, he sat on the bench where he had left the flower pot years before and just stared. He knew that the plaque had not been the company's idea. I knew that only one person would have the courage to write it so sweetly and firmly at the same time. It didn't need a signature. It was the kind of message that only a wounded but not bitter soul could leave, a reminder that even what has been crushed can still blossom in others. The next day, he sent an envelope to the company's gardening department with no name. Inside was a dried flower, the daisy from the book, and a short note: "So that you may never stop hearing what has no sound." No one answered. But weeks later, a daisy was planted right next to the sign, and even those who passed by every day without understanding felt that this place was different. Time did not go back. Nothing started again, but something inside him finally settled down. Graham now lived his days with less haste, less ambition, less fear. The man who had been celebrated for his right decisions was now remembered for his calm presence on the mornings at the market, for his slow conversations in the bakery line, for his hands covered in dirt, growing small flowers in makeshift pots in the backyard. He had fewer certainties, more questions, and in them he found shelter. But he still carried a silent space inside him, a place where she lived, not as an unattainable woman or a lost love, but as a symbol of what he only learned too late. Until one autumn morning, when he was taking a bus to the city center, he noticed something unusual in the landscape. At the entrance to the old building where he had worked for decades, a small movement was forming. Children in school shirts were sitting around the garden, listening to a woman who spoke about the cycle of plants, about how nature responds with beauty even to neglect. Graham got off at the next stop, walked around the sidewalk, and approached calmly, as if afraid of being noticed. The woman, with her back to him, was gesturing gently, showing a flower between her fingers. He recognized that gesture, the way she held the flower, with care and respect, and then she turned around. It was Charlotte. Time had passed, of course. Soft lines marked her face. Her hair was now loose, held back only by a ribbon. But it was her, and in that moment the world seemed to hold its breath. She saw him too. She stopped. Her eyes met his, and the silence between them, which had once held pain, now held maturity. She smiled. Not a wide smile, nor an inviting one, but a smile of peace, and he responded with a restrained nod, full of everything he had never said. Charlotte turned to the children and pointed to the plaque in the garden, the one that read, "In memory of," gestures that should never have been trampled upon. And then she told the story, not with names or titles or details, but gently. She said that there was a time when a flower was left every morning by hands that only wanted to make someone's day better, and that one day that flower was called Poor Man's Thing. The children looked at each other, curious. Then she said that not all wounds turn into anger. Some turn into gardens. Graham didn't stay until the end. He knew that this moment wasn't his, but before he left, he took one last look at the flower bed, and there in the center he noticed something new. A small blue flower, alone, growing among the daisies and lavender. A flower he knew. It wasn't a flower shop. It was hers. And being there meant that something had been sealed, that the purest gesture, the one that arises without demands, still found space to live. That night, when he got home, he wrote a single sentence in his notebook. I destroyed what I did not understand, and I was saved by what flourished in spite of it. He calmly closed the notebook, went to the balcony and watered the pots with a tenderness he did not know he had. And there, under the sky of an ordinary late afternoon, he understood that true forgiveness is not what we hear with our ears. It is what we feel when we are looked at and still welcomed. And so, without grand endings, without declarations, without forced reunions, the story ended. Or rather, it blossomed. Because the man who once said that flowers were poor people's things now lived because of one that was never bought. A flower planted in silence, picked with pain, and years later left on the ground as a symbol of everything that cannot be explained, only felt. If this story touched your heart, leave your like now. This helps more people understand that even silence can transform a life. Write in the comments. I also believe that flowers carry stories. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this which speak softly, but stay forever. And now click on the video that is appearing on your screen. He tells the story of someone who was ignored until a simple gesture revealed a deep truth. You will feel it. You will understand it. And maybe you will remember someone.